The least useful way of working with functions might look like this. And you'll notice I don't have any arguments. I don't have any return values. Everything happens inside the function. And I can still use this function. It still takes that code and groups it together under a name. I could reuse that function if I can find more than one place that it's useful. But I've locked myself in because int a and int b now are defined inside the function. So they're always going to be 5 and 6. Every time I call the function, it's the same numbers. And what's worse, or what's more, I guess I should say, is that those two numbers are always going to go into that same formula and be displayed in the same div. And so when I call that function, the same thing is going to happen every time, right? Display div.innerText is going to display the number 11 because that's the sum of those two numbers. And every time I call it, it's going to produce the exact same result in the exact same place. Now, that might be useful in some cases to build a function that way, but it's also very limiting. So you want to think strategically about your functions as you build them in terms of how might I use this, or how might I use this in other ways in my code, or what are the limitations that I'm willing to accept to simplify my code in other cases. So there's a lot of things to think about as you create functions, but it's good to know that you have that flexibility as well as those abilities in terms of the power of your functions. So in code, that function might look like this, and that's it. That's all I would need to do to call that function is just add num, and I do have to include parentheses, but they don't have to have anything in them because it doesn't take any arguments anymore. So when I call that function, every time I call it in my code, that result is going to appear directly in display div. So it's simple, but it's also less powerful. Okay, so in this last iteration of this type of interactivity with functions, I'm going to make the function call as simple as possible, but I'm also, in doing that, going to lock myself in to a specific source for that data. So I have the function now does not need any arguments, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to hard code those into the function itself. I'm going to say int a equals value a, and I'm going to say int b equals value b. I could have just as easily given these static numbers, right? But I'm going to at least pull those from the form. But now when I call this function, all I do is call add number. And the big thing that I get back here is that now I can call this function directly from a button. So if I unhide one of these buttons, and now I can actually use this directly in an event handler. If you remember, an event handler has to have a function with no parameters if you want to call it directly from the handler. Otherwise, you need to use an anonymous function or a wrapper function to call those with the parameters. So now I could call this directly from an event handler. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So if I do button 1, add event listener, and we'll go click, and then I'm going to use add number, right? And there is my whole code for that. So if I save that and I click button 1, you can see that I've made it very simple to add that. And the downside, of course, is that add number only is going to take from these fields because it's part of the function now. I can't change that on the fly. And I can't display that anywhere else. So this specific function is only going to take from value A and value B, and it's only going to display here. So I have more simplicity, but I have less flexibility. So those are kind of the trade-offs. When you're building your function, you want to think about how you can build a function to do what you're going to need it to do in the future. Because if I want to, let's say, add a different event listener somewhere, and I want to use this function in a more generic way, I have to do things a little bit differently, right? So those are just sort of the things you want to think about when you're building your functions is, do I need this function to be more generic, or is it better to have it more simple and less generic, or more specific to the exact thing that I want it to do? It really just depends on how much you want to reuse that function throughout your code.